Hi everyone, my name is Max and I'm from the Pen and Brick channel. Now, it's been a while since I've uploaded anything and I've realized that I've been a little bit busy, but I didn't want to start forgetting what I learned on Blender, so I wanted to make sure I can squeeze in another tutorial before my memory is basically wiped away, as I am doing mostly Revit at the moment. But whenever there's a chance to do a competition, I try to sneak in some Blender whenever I can in the office, so hopefully me covering one of my older projects will be quite useful for yourself, so that you can look at the techniques, the skills, the tools that I use to create an architectural vision with Blender. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. This competition was for the Toyota Logistic 2024 competition, and my approach was very architectural. What I wanted to look at is something that rethinks the logistics of a system, and in this case is rethinking the logistical system behind how we throw away our used tires. Now, there's about 4 billion tires worldwide currently in landfills, and I wanted to find a way that I could use those essentially tires as a form of cladding for temporary structures. So what I looked at in this competition was how I could use some of the material from tire graveyards, such as the tire graveyard in Kuwait, how I could use alternative sources of materials such as rice husk blocks for the insulation, as well as methods of converting both of these into components that could be mass produced and mass built. So the idea was to have a relatively quick on-site assembly using these elements, and they're essentially small enclosures where you could work or dine or eat at. They're not looking at doing any MEP services. They're very, very straightforward, but it was a really fun project. I really enjoyed the process of it, and so now I'm going to show you how some of it was done in Blender. So here we are now in the Blender file, and as you can see, if I scroll out, it looks a little bit strange. Now I recommend you watch the first video about Blender and architecture that I produced. It covers a little bit more of the basic topics, and this conversation I'm going to try to keep it going a little bit more and be a little bit more detailed. So what I'm doing here is setting up an HDRI. What an HDRI does is it emulates the lighting conditions of an area, so that when you render out your scene, it's going to have similar lighting properties such as bounce lights, that's going to come through some of the coloration from the environment around. So I went for a very urban looking HDRI, and the way to do this in Blender is you've got your shader editor up here, and your shader editor, what you can do is you can jump from your objects that you are currently texturing to the world itself. And within the world itself, I found an image that I liked. If I remember well, I went on Polyhaven, but I could have even used BlenderKit, which is an add-on you can get to Blender to get these HDRIs. And once it was connected, I just added a photographic backdrop, which is something that looks like this. Very common when you're working with product designers, and when they're rendering out scenes, you want to have a nice curved bounce light, and so you tend to create this shape. The way that I sequenced my shot was quite straightforward. I had two cameras that were set up. One was an isometric camera and one was just for a perspective. And if I scroll quickly onto the animation, it's essentially about the car coming in, the wheel being detached, that wheel becoming the cladding component where other elements are built up to create that wall structure, and then explaining how multiple of these elements can come together, adding a door, a window, and a little bit of lighting, and then explaining with some inhabitation what I really wanted to have happen in these spaces. So it really is a quite simple technique that I use to make all of these transitions. They're essentially point A and point B with either a rotation or an expansion in the Z, X and Y. To give an example, this first car that comes in, of course, Toyota with the project name on it at the back, all I had to do was parent it to an object and then just tell where that parent should go. And as you can see, when it starts to slide down, it doesn't go into the void, it just basically goes below. So anytime I wanted to hide an element, I would just have that element come just below the plane. And for some of the more complex animations, it's actually kind of working backwards and figuring out what effect you want to get and then how you're going to do it. So a great example of this is the wheel sequence. So the wheel sequence is when we zoom into one of the wheels and I explain how the components are going to be recycled to form parts of the building. And so the part I'm really looking at is the tire right here. So this tire component, which is the central element, I wanted to split out from the outer ring and then have it straighten up. And all I needed to do from this, it was backwards actually. So I knew that for the building component itself, I wanted the shape to be flat. So what I did was I started with looking at this shape. And by adding, if you can see, this round curve right here, connect this to a parameter. So this round curve that goes around. And as you can see, when the curve expands, you start to get it straightened. So this isn't absolutely technical. The point isn't to get something that is an architecturally precise drawing or model or illustration. The point here is just to reflect what you want to have shown. And here was just transition from a wheel up to a cladding panel. And as you can see, this was simply a 3D model that I had cut out and then I had copy pasted forward. So this was an array. Now you could even just use a texture if you wanted to, but I wanted to make sure that you had some nice bounce lighting between the different cracks of this element. Going up close, the texture is horrible. I didn't even spend a lot of time texture mapping, which is essentially the art of making sure that your object is properly textured and looks correct at scale. But because these are all in transition and you don't really zoom in, there was no need to. And then some other really simple tricks. So for instance, I wanted to have this build up with some timber studs right on the side, the rice husk that I mentioned before come up. And so all that I need to do for the rice husk is just give it 2 points, the upper point and then the lower point. And this essentially goes up. Same with some of the framing for this husk. So all I needed to do, as you can see here, these are almost like bamboo-ish elements that would hold up and support the rice husk that is compressed, is if you look at the array button right here, what I'm doing is I'm essentially increasing that array as it goes up. So it gives the impression that this structure is climbing up the module. And then this is where it gets kind of fun and a bit architectural. Once this module has been taken, what I wanted to express is this idea that you could build this singular module and then by combining them together, you could create a larger space. So the way that I did this, again, very, very simply, I used the same method, and the same method being I'm just using an array. So all this is an array of buildings. Now I could extend this as much as I wanted to. And by having it split up, I can dictate where that distance is, giving the illusion that this building is actually all coming together. But all it is one single component. And what that helps you do as well in terms of the modeling is that instead of having copy pastes every single time you're working in something, you're just using one element, which saves up a lot of memory for your computer. Another aspect of this whole sequence that I really like, and it's a little bit of a cheat again, is when I have the floor expanding so that it covers the entirety of the space. And again, here the idea was to use a material that is recycled from these tires that are going to be thrown into landfills. And the way that I did this quite simply was, again, to set up 2 points. One of the points is when it's finished. And so all I'm doing here is I'm going to the scale and I'm changing the scale of the item. And this means that I can decide how I want it to look at the correct scale and just work backwards so that when it appears out of shot, it's at a negative and it falls down. So as you can see, this element starts from below and then goes above. And so as I mentioned, there are 2 cameras being used in these shots. The first is an isometric view. So if I clean this up, where you can see everything remains at the same perspectives. All I'm doing is I'm zooming in and out. But once I wanted to show some of the inhabitation within the space, I wanted to give an impression of what it is to walk through the space. So what I did was I just changed cameras. What I'm essentially doing with this camera is I'm positioning it with a 3D perspective. I'm zooming into the space and then I'm zooming back out of the space. And just to look at the components a little bit more, all of these objects are just Blender Kit objects. So again, not spending a lot of time detailing and modeling these because you don't really need to when you're presenting a vision or something architectural. You can essentially kit patch. And what I did was I took all these elements and I would just sequence them so that they would jump up and down. Now, the additional piece of animation is that little in between, as you can see, where it goes up and there's a little twist and they come back down. Now, that's just to sell the realism of the animation itself. If you didn't have that, it would just look like pieces that would come up and then down. Now, having them jump gives you that illusion that there's something moving. How do you then do just the simple shots? And the simple shots are using the exact same methodology. What I'm looking at is setting up a camera and then just from this, getting a still that usually is a higher quality than what I'm working with. I tend to work with cycles because cycles is more precise and the light bounce are more precise. But when it's a little bit more abstract, I prefer using Eevee. This would have been the final image that I'm going to be using. Having this vista right here where I'm cutting off the corners so you don't see that HDRI in the background. And if I were to change this to a different renderer, such as Cycles, it would have given me a more accurate depiction of the space. But one thing to notice, as you can see right here, is that you need to make sure that all the materials that you've assigned are compatible for Cycles and for Eevee. And what I mean by that is when you're setting up certain objects, coming down into the shader editor, some of the material output is going to be set to all, some to Eevee, some to Cycles. So you have to make sure that it is compatible. And usually there is a little bit of work to make something look correct in Cycles compared to something that looks correct in Eevee. It's not a pure science. Sometimes you just have to play around with the materials and textures. So that's it. I just wanted to do a very quick tutorial to cover some of these. Now, albeit this episode I think is a little bit quicker pace and I think I've skipped through a couple of items, but I just wanted to make it slightly more condensed with slightly less information. And again, if you want to have a little bit more of all that juicy information, well, you can check out the last episode where I covered the Coral Manufacture Station, another competition I did using Blender. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you'll click on another video. Bye.